All right, so this is the study number 5 in the series Imagine All the People. We're in Matthew chapter 5, 27 to 32. This is, again, the pre-study video for this passage, and it's called Adultery. So we're going to be in the passage, again, Matthew chapter 5, 27 to 32. So if you haven't read it, go ahead, pause the video, go ahead and read it. And just digest it and mark down any questions. I think this part is very important for you to take that step of just digesting it on your own before you watch the video. So go ahead and do that. Okay, now let's dive into it. First of all, these passages obviously are about divorce and lust, and the key concept that kind of ties them together is the idea of adultery. So Jesus basically says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but if you lust after a woman, you're committing adultery. And then it also talks about divorce, and it's like, you've heard it said, just give a certificate of divorce, and then you can get divorced. But if you do that, you're actually committing adultery, and you're making her commit adultery too. So the key concept that ties the two things together is actually adultery. So Jesus is talking about an Old Testament command, and he's expounding on it and telling us what the intent and the heart of God's wisdom behind that command. Okay, so he's not actually making new laws, and that's one of the first things you need to know when we approach this. Is it sometimes seems like, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, all Jesus is doing is taking the old laws and making them stricter, more difficult, more ideal. And he is doing that in a certain sense, but that's not what he always does. There's other passages elsewhere in the New Testament where he actually relaxes some of the Old Testament laws. So it's not about actually relaxing or making it stricter. Sometimes it'll seem stricter. Sometimes it'll seem more relaxed than the Old Testament. But the point is that you need to interpret the heart and the intent and God's wisdom behind those laws. So for both of these passages on divorce and lust, he's looking at what's the heart and intent behind do not commit adultery. So you could even think about that for yourself before you even read what Jesus says. Read the command that says you should not commit adultery. What does that mean? What does that entail? What's the full picture that God's trying to teach us by telling us don't commit adultery? It's just one command. If we just take it just as flat, oh, don't commit adultery, and that's it, then we're going to miss a lot of the intent and wisdom behind that command. That's what Jesus is trying to get to. Okay? Before we get into all of this, I do want to I have this little note on singleness. Okay, so some of you might have single people in your group, or you might have the majority of your people are single. And these passages do talk about sex and marriage and all that. And obviously, adultery is related to marriage. So sometimes it could be difficult to relate to this or whatever. But basically, you can look at Matthew chapter 19 verses 10 to 12. And Matthew chapter 19 verses 1 through 12 is very important, actually, to help us understand what Jesus is talking about in this passage. So you can go ahead and read that. But talks about Jesus himself he says that marriage is not for everyone. Jesus himself was never married. Jesus himself never had sex. So it's not an essential part of human beings to be married. In church and in Christian culture, we often just push all single people towards marriage. I think that's wrong. The Bible clearly doesn't do that. Jesus himself clearly doesn't do that. Obviously, Jesus himself was single. Paul was single. So some of the biggest people in the New Testament were single. So singleness is very important, actually. And so we shouldn't be pushing everyone in our churches to get married. And in our church, we shouldn't focus everything around marriage and family necessarily, because there's big parts of life that are outside of that. Now, the wider culture talks about, it doesn't necessarily say marriage, everyone should be getting married and pushing everyone to get married, but it does push sex as an essential part of being a human. It's like, okay, marriage, yeah, whatever. But every human being has sexuality. Every human being needs to be having sex. And it highly values sex. And I don't think Scripture says that either. Jesus never had sex. And so sex is not an essential part of being a human being either. Sexuality is not necessarily an essential part of being a human being. You can be fully human, live the most vibrant, thriving, happy life without having sex. And so, but I do think Scripture teaches that marriage and sex are essential. Sex is essential in marriage, but marriage and sex are not essential to be a human being. Okay, so I want to make that as an important distinction. And for people who are single, and also it's good to know for people who are married too, that sex is an essential part of your marriage, but is not an essential part of being human. Okay, so I just want to start off with that kind of disclaimer. Okay, so this is a very long and not long, obviously it's just a short passage, but it can be a very complex passage. So you don't have to go through all the questions, but there's a lot there. And there could be a lot of questions that come up, and I do ask a lot of questions. If you don't think that they're all that important or whatever, you can skip some of them. But it can get complicated, so it's just kind of like a warning, okay? So, well, the first thing about lust, okay, is why is lust wrong? Why should we not lust? And there's a couple different things. First of all, remember that we're looking at what's the heart behind the command of do not commit adultery. What's God's wisdom behind that? And Jesus relates that to lust. Okay? So, is it that lust, what's wrong with lust? Is it that lust leads to adultery? And some people talk about this in relation to anger. That anger leads to murder. That's why anger is wrong. I don't think so. I don't think that lust leading to adultery is the reason why lust is wrong. Because first of all, does lust really always lead to adultery? And I think often it doesn't. But is it still wrong in that case? If the logic is lust is wrong because it leads to adultery, then lust is, if you're lusting but it's not leading to adultery, then it'd be okay, right? But I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. In the same way with the anger and the murder thing. It's not just, okay, yeah, you can get angry as long as it doesn't lead to murder. That's not what it's about. It's about anger itself. It indicates broken relationships. So here, in this case, the lust itself, there's something broken about that when you're lusting after, in this case, it says a woman, right? If you're lusting after someone outside of your marriage, if that's not your spouse, there's something broken and wrong with that. I think that that's the intent behind it. Other people might argue that the intent behind Jesus' command here is saying that it's wrong to objectify people. It's wrong to objectify women, right? That looking at them as an object is wrong. And obviously that is wrong, but I don't think that's actually what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is not saying he's not emphasizing the objectifying thing. Because remember, Jesus is trying to get at the heart behind the command, do not commit adultery. He's not, we're trying to find the heart behind his command, do not lust. But do not lust is trying to get to the heart behind committing adultery. So actually it has to do with adultery and marriage. The do not lust command. It's not necessarily just don't objectify people in general. Well, I think that is true, that we shouldn't objectify people in general. I don't think that that's exactly what he's getting at here. It has much more to do specifically with marriage and adultery. Okay? So I think what it's trying to say and why lust is wrong is because God designed sex and sexual desire to be within the marriage. And when it's not just the sex, but it's also the sexual desire that's part of what holds the marriage together. It's part of what creates that union and bond. And we'll see some of those passages a little bit later. But lust for a woman or a man, if you're a woman, outside of marriage breaks that. So God designed all the sexual desire to be for your spouse. And if that sexual desire is going out of the marriage, then that already breaks that ideal. So sexual desire is actually very good within marriage. Okay, and that brings us to another point, which is a lot of people will cite these passages of don't lust as just like, oh, don't have sexual desire, period. That's what it means. I don't think that that's what it means. Again, because you have to look at what is the command he's addressing. The original command he's addressing, again, don't commit adultery. And within the context of that, it's saying, what is the lust? Why is lust bad within that context? So it's not just lust in general is bad or sexual desire in general is bad. No, it's that sexual desire has a specific purpose, which is the marriage. And outside of that marriage, that sexual desire is inappropriate. It's wrong. So the Bible is not being sex negative. Actually, there's whole books in the Bible, Song of Songs, which is very graphic, actually, about about cultivating sexual desire and how good sexual desire is and how you need to increase your sexual desire. And that's kind of what Song of Song talks about a lot. So the Bible itself is not sex negative. In fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 talks about how husbands and wives should be having sex and should be having sex regularly. So actually, sex and sexual desire is very encouraged, and not just for procreation or whatever purposes, but because it creates the bond between the man and the woman. So that is so when we look at this, why is lust wrong? It's not saying sexual desire period is wrong. It's saying sexual desire outside of marriage is wrong. Okay? Now let's look at the divorce thing a little bit. Again, you can read Matthew chapter 19, 1 to 12. I think that talks about divorce. It also talks about marriage a little bit. And it talks about how God made man and woman one flesh. And that's the union and bond between them. And that is a sexual connection. The one flesh is talking about sex. It is. So you can read Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. It talks about Moses saying, hey, if you want to get a divorce, send your wife away with a certificate of divorce. And the point of that law is actually to protect the women, because a lot of men, and this is a patriarchal society, an unattached woman is a precarious situation. So the law that Moses gave is saying, hey, don't just send your wife away and say, I don't want you anymore. You have to give her the certificate of divorce so that other men will know, okay, she's been divorced, now she's eligible for remarriage. Okay, that's the purpose of the certificate of divorce. But in Jesus' time, people were kind of abusing that and say, okay, well, I can just get rid of my wife if I don't want her. Just send her away for divorce. So the purpose of Jesus saying you're not supposed to get divorced is to guard against this. And the same thing is with the lust thing, and the same thing is with the murder and the anger thing. People just read the law and say, okay, it says don't murder. Well, I can just be angry and upset and bitter against people, and that's fine. I'm not breaking the law. I can look at other women and lust after them. As long as I'm not committing adultery, I'm not breaking the law. And here it's like I can divorce my wife as long as I give her a certificate. I'm not breaking the law. But Jesus is saying, no, you guys are missing the point. That's not the heart. That's not the wisdom behind God's law. We have to look at what is the heart behind God's law. So Jesus is not actually trying to tear down the Old Testament law. He's trying to say, what is the heart behind that Old Testament law? What's the heart behind Moses saying you can have a certificate divorce? So Jesus is not actually abolishing that law, though it really does look like it. He's not saying, hey, don't get divorced in any circumstances. In fact, he even gives the exception of sexual immorality, right? And Paul actually gives exceptions otherwise about desertion and other cases. But also, and I don't think the Bible doesn't actually talk about this, but I think there are other extenuating circumstances where divorce is permissible, like physical abuse, other things like that. But that's not really the point. The point is not, okay, look for what, and we read the Bible like this all the time. We're like, when is it okay to get a divorce? Is physical abuse okay? Is it desertion okay? Is blah 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 okay? When is it okay? That's not the point. Jesus' point is not to say, okay, find out all the exceptions and stuff like that. There are exceptions. I'm telling you there are, but that's not the point. It's not the point to emphasize those things. The point is to emphasize God wants you guys to stay together. God created marriage to be a permanent, awesome, beautiful union, a sexual union, and it's supposed to be a permanent sexual union. And that's the entire point of the do not commit adultery passage or command in Ten Commandments. And that's what Jesus is getting to. So often people will read this command in the Sermon on the Mount and say, okay, you can these are the reasons why you can get divorced. Sexual immorality or adultery, you can get a divorce. No reason other than that. That's not the point. Don't look for the reasons why you can or cannot, and don't read it like a law. You want to look at the wisdom and heart behind it that will improve your current marriage, even if you're never thinking about divorce. Again, this passage only, if you're going to read it like a law, then this passage only applies to people who are thinking about getting divorced. But I don't think that that's the case. I think this passage about divorce actually applies to people who are married and even have a decently healthy marriage. It's saying, be bonded together. Think about your relationship as a deep, permanent sexual relationship that's permanently bonded together with each other. And if you think of your marriage like that, then the issues of divorce are going to fade away. Okay? Okay, so this passage is also seemingly very harsh, right? It says, hey, it's better to poke out your eye and cut off your hand than to go to hell, right? What about someone who has been divorced? Or what about someone who is struggling or has struggled with pornography? What about someone who has had an affair? Is there any grace for you if I've done that, or if you've done that? Is there any grace for us? And one of the difficulties of this passage, again, is that people have used this passage to judge people. To say, you're a divorced man or woman, we're going to look down on you. Or you're addicted to porn. You're disgusting. You're perverted. That's not the point of this passage. And we're going to look at it again in Matthew chapter 7, and where it talks about don't judge. But this passage is for self-reflection. It's to help us realize. Remember, the context is people thinking that they're righteous. But Jesus saying, no, you're not. You're not up to the standard. That's kind of the point of it, this passage. The point is to say, this is my ideal. Strive for this ideal. We're not at the ideal yet. Don't think you're at the ideal. The point of the passage is to show you how you're supposed to read the Old Testament and to point to God's ideal and God's wisdom, not for you to look at other people and say, you are bad. And it's not for us to look at ourselves and go, we are bad from it. That's not the point of this passage. There is grace, and I listened to study many other passages where God showed grace to an adulterous woman, where the Bible talks about a broken heart and a contrite spirit, that God will not despise a broken heart and contrite spirit. Earlier we talked about how a spirit of mourning, spiritual poverty, those are the people who inherit the kingdom of God. So the passage is really for self-examination. And I do think that the church has often taken passages like this and used it to judge people. If someone were to tell you, I'm addicted to porn, what's your thought that goes through your head? If you think, ooh, disgusting, or ooh, that's bad, I can't believe you did that, I'm telling you, we're already teetering on the edge of being judgmental or self-righteous. That's not the point of these passages. The point of the passage is not to say, oh, you're divorced. I can't believe someone's thinking about getting divorced, or I can't believe someone's struggling that hard in their marriage. It's not the point. The point is not to say, oh, you're struggling in your marriage, don't get divorced. Whatever happens, don't get divorced. That's not the point of the passage. The point of the passage is for us ourselves to examine, ourselves and our own motivations say, hey, we want to keep our marriages together. It's not to become a new law. That's not Jesus' intention. Jesus is not creating a new, stricter law. He's trying to teach us how to interpret the heart and intent behind the passages. So we don't want to use these passages to judge other people. And we don't want to use these other passages to say, there's no grace for me. The entire gospel is about brokenness, recognizing your brokenness, being redeemed from your brokenness. If we don't have that as part of this, then we're missing the point. We're not really understanding the true heart of what Jesus is trying to get at. The passages are not trying to tell you you're a bad person. That's not what it's trying to tell you. It's trying to tell you is God's ideal. Let's strive towards this awesome goodness and ideal of what God wants. Think about it this way. Do we ever say, oh, you got angry. Oh, you're such a bad person. Oh, that's disgusting. You're an angry person. No! So if we don't interpret the murder and anger passage that way, why do we interpret the lust and divorce passage that way? They're right next to each other in the Sermon on the Mount. They are the same point. There's case studies of the same principles. We need to be more serious about our own sin. A lot more serious. But also we need to be less condemning. And again, we're going to get into that in chapter 7. Okay, so how do we live this out? How do we live out this passage? Well, the first thing is, I think for people who are married, we do need to recognize that sexual desire is for marriage. And God has this permanent union that He's created. And you can, again, read 1 Corinthians chapter 7 if you want more information about this, or Matthew chapter 19. Those have a more wider rounded view, talking about marriage as a whole. It's like marriage is a sexual union, a sexual bond between a man and a woman. That's what marriage is. And so sex is essential within that marriage, and sexual desire is actually essential within a marriage. But it's not supposed to be outside of that marriage. So I think some practical things is pornography. And I know we don't talk about pornography. We don't talk about pornography in church, and a lot of people maybe you struggle, or people struggle with pornography, and it's hidden. First of all, I don't want to condemn you if you struggle with things like that, or even lust. Maybe you're not struggling with pornography, but other types of lust. That's not the point. But the point is that sexual desire is being wasted and used inappropriately. It's not supposed to go there. It's supposed to go towards your wife or your husband, your spouse. That's where it's supposed to go. And it will affect your marriage. There's a lot of scientific research about how pornography or whatever affects your marriage and that type of thing. So a core part of the corollary of that is also that you should cultivate the sexual desire within your marriage. Okay? Don't think the sexual desire is bad. That's not what this is about. So sometimes you're like, okay, I don't want to lust after women, so I'm not going to lust at all. I'm not going to have any desire at all. And if I just have a desire for my wife or whatever, then it's wrong. Or I'm embarrassed of it at least, or something like that. That's not the case either. You need to channel that desire away from pornography, away from other women or other men, towards your husband or wife. That's one of the main things I think that we can take away from this passage. Another thing is divorce. If you're having, again, this is something that we don't talk about in church, which I think is wrong. If you're having struggles or serious difficulties in your marriage, we need to work that out. I know we don't talk about that, but the intention of marriage is to have that bond be strong and permanent. And if it's on shaky ground, we need to try to work and restore that. So take that seriously. Don't ignore that. If you don't feel that strong, permanent bond with your husband or wife, and maybe everything's going okay, but you don't feel that, work to cultivate that. Or if you have been through a divorce, or if you have people in your group who have been through or are considering, then that needs to be worked through too. first of all, it's not in a condemnation way. It's not like, this is the law, don't do this. Don't get divorced. It's, this is the ideal. Can we help you get to the ideal? That's the approach we need to take in marriage. So, can we share this with each other? Break into groups, men and women, separate or whatever, and share it. I struggle with pornography, or we're struggling in our marriage. I think that's the first step, is to just be able to confess and talk about that in a non-condemning way. And if we cannot do that, we're going to continue to have some of these underlying issues and problems that never come to the surface until something big explodes. I'm sure you guys have had experiences. I've had experiences where it's like, there's a couple, they're doing fine in church, and all of a sudden they stop going to church. And you're like, why? What happened to them? And you try to find out, and then later you find out, oh, they got separated. Oh, they're divorced. And the reason why they left the church is because they didn't feel like they could go through that struggle in that church community. We don't want to be a church community like that. So we want to encourage that kind of openness and just acceptance of the struggles and working those struggles out towards the ideal. We're not letting go of that ideal. But it's the process of getting there, which is not law and condemnation, but recognizing the ideal, loving the ideal, and moving towards that. All right?